He believed this would be the moment everyone remembered him as the professor who put an arrogant outsider in her place. But he had no idea he was about to walk straight into his own humiliation. The lecture hall at Westbridge University gleamed under bright overhead lights. Rows of polished desks filled with over 200 students, their laptops open, their attention fixed on Professor Daniel Whitmore, a man known for his precision, his reputation, and his intolerance for mistakes. His voice carried the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to command silence, every word measured, every movement deliberate. And then there was Emily Carter standing near the back, almost invisible in a simple gray sweater and worn jeans. Her presence, so quiet it barely registered to anyone around her. She wasn't enrolled in the class. No one had seen her take notes or speak up before. She looked like someone who didn't belong in a room built for the top math students in the state. But that morning something. Air shifted, growing heavier, charged with expectation. Emily hesitated just a fraction of a second, then stepped forward, each footstep echoing faintly against the polished floor. Every eye now locked onto her, waiting, watching, ready to witness what they assumed would be a mistake. Whitmore turned back to the board, already preparing the next move, already certain of the outcome, because in his mind this was already over. He just didn't know it yet. Emily Carter could feel every eye in the room pressing. Deliberate, the noise in the room began to fade, not because it stopped, but because she no longer seemed to hear it. Whitmore watched closely, now a flicker of curiosity crossing his expression, though it was quickly masked by confidence. He had seen this before, students freezing under pressure, their minds going blank. When placed on the spot, he expected the same outcome. Here, Emily lifted the chalk toward the board, her hand pausing just inches from the surface. A single second stretched into two, then three. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. And then she wrote the first line, clean, precise, without hesitation, the sound of chalk against the board, sharp and steady. It was not the uncertain scribble of someone guessing. It was controlled, intentional, a continuation rather than an attempt. A few students straightened in their seats, their expressions shifting ever so slightly. Whitmore's arms remained crossed, but his posture changed almost imperceptibly, his attention sharpening as Emily moved to the next step, her writing fluid, her pace measured. She did not rush, and she did not falter, and in that quiet unfolding something began to change in the room. Though no one spoke, it was there, in the stillness, in the absence of laughter, in the way every eye followed the movement of her hand, because for the first time it no longer looked like she was about to fail. It looked like she knew exactly what she was doing. The rhythm of chalk against the board continued, steady and deliberate, each line connecting seamlessly to the next, as if the equation had always been waiting for her to finish it. A quiet tension spread across the lecture hall, the kind that did not come from noise, but from its absence. Laptops were forgotten, half-typed notes left hanging on screens. No one moved, no one whispered. Even the students who had laughed moments earlier now sat upright, their eyes fixed on the board, trying to follow steps that suddenly felt faster than they should have been. Emily Carter did not look back. She did not check the room. She did not seek approval. Her focus remained entirely on the mathematics in front of her, her handwriting clean, structured, almost elegant, each symbol placed with certainty, as though doubt had never existed. Professor Whitmore's gaze narrowed slightly, his confidence no longer as effortless as before. He had expected hesitation, confusion, perhaps even silence, but this was something else entirely. He uncrossed his arms without realizing it, taking a small step forward, his attention drawn not just to the fact that she was solving the problem, but how she was doing it. There were no unnecessary movements, no corrections, no pauses to reconsider. She was not searching for the answer, she was unfolding it, and that difference began to settle heavily in the room. A student near the front leaned closer to his notebook, attempting to keep up, but quickly fell behind. Another slowly lowered her pen, her eyes widening as the realization began to form. This was not guesswork, this was mastery. Emily reached the midpoint of the derivation, and for a brief moment, she stopped, the chalk hovering just above the board. A single breath passed through the room, like a quiet wave. Whitmore watched closely, now his expression tightening almost imperceptibly, because this was the point where most students struggled. Solution, and in that moment, before anyone fully understood what she had done, the balance in the room quietly began to change. The final line lingered on the board like a quiet challenge to everything that had come before it, the chalk still in Emily Carter's hand. As she stepped back, just half a pace, her eyes steady, not defiant, not uncertain, simply certain. A silence fell so complete it felt almost deliberate, as if the room itself had chosen to stop breathing. Professor Whitmore stared at the Equation, his gaze moving quickly at first, then slower, then stopping entirely on the final addition. She had made it was subtle, almost elegant, a single transformation that reframed the entire solution, and with it exposed something he had not anticipated. His jaw tightened, just slightly, the kind of reaction most would miss. But in that moment, every student was watching him, now not her, waiting for his response, for confirmation that what they had just witnessed was either brilliance or mistake. Whitmore stepped closer to the board, his presence no longer as commanding as it had been minutes ago. His hand lifted, as if to point something out, but hesitated mid-air, because there was nothing to correct. The logic held firm, every transition aligned, every conclusion inevitable. He traced the steps again, more carefully this time, and the realization settled deeper. This was not only correct, it revealed an inefficiency in his own derivation, one he had taught for years, without question. A quiet shift moved through the room like a ripple. Students glanced at one another, their expressions no longer amused, but unsettled. A few leaned forward, as if seeing their professor for the first time from a different angle. Emily remained still beside the board, her posture relaxed, her hands now resting lightly at her sides. She did not speak. She did not need to. Whitmore cleared his throat, the sound sharper than he intended, breaking the silence, but not restoring his control. He turned slightly toward her, his voice measured though lacking its earlier certainty. "Can you explain that last step?" he asked, the question careful, neutral, but carrying an undertone that betrayed his need for clarity. Emily nodded, once her voice calm, as she gestured toward the equation. "The original approach assumes continuity at that point, but if you apply the limit definition more directly, you can simplify the expression and avoid the extra substitution." She said, her explanation concise, precise, the kind that did not waste words and did not leave gaps. A murmur spread again, this time harder to contain. A student in the front row slowly shook his head, as if trying to reconcile what he had just heard. Whitmore's eyes returned to the board following her explanation, and finding no flaw, only confirmation. The weight of the moment pressed in around him, the authority he had worn so easily now feeling fragile under the quiet scrutiny of the room. And then something even heavier settled, the understanding that this had never been about a mistake. She had pointed out something real, and he had chosen to turn it into a spectacle, and now the spectacle had turned on him. The room remained still, waiting not for the equation, but for what came next. And for the first time, Professor Whitmore did not have the immediate answer. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted slowly, like a room learning how to breathe again, but no one spoke, not yet, the weight of what had just happened still pressing against every surface, every thought, every expectation that had walked into that lecture hall. Now, quietly unraveling, Professor Whitmore stood inches from the board, his eyes fixed on the final line, as if staring long enough might change it, but it did not change. It held firm, unshaken by doubt or authority. Behind him, the students waited, their attention no longer divided, no longer distracted. It was focused entirely on him, now, the same way it had once been focused on her, and that reversal settled heavily in the air. Emily Carter remained beside the board, calm, composed, her presence no longer invisible, no longer something to overlook. There was no trace of triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, no challenge, just quiet certainty, the kind that did not need recognition to exist. Whitmore finally stepped back, his hand lowering slowly to his side, the movement deliberate, as though he were recalibrating something unseen. His voice, when it came, was controlled, but different, stripped of its earlier edge. "That is an interesting approach," he said, though the words felt thinner than they should have, as if they carried less weight than before. A few students exchanged glances, the phrasing careful, almost cautious. Emily gave a small nod, her voice steady. "It is a more direct one," she replied, not correcting him, not challenging him, simply stating what was already evident. A pause followed, longer this time, stretching across the room, as Whitmore considered his next move, because this was no longer about an equation. It was about control, about presence, about the invisible hierarchy that had just been disrupted. He turned slightly toward the class, as if to re-establish the structure of the room, but the shift in attention was undeniable. Students were no longer looking to him for confirmation. They were thinking, processing, re-evaluating. One student, near the middle, raised his hand slowly, then lowered it again, unsure if speaking would break something that had not yet settled. Whitmore cleared his throat once more, attempting to regain momentum, as he gestured toward the board. "The method I presented is still valid," he said, his tone firmer now, but lacking the certainty that once defined it. Emily's eyes moved briefly to the equation, then back to him. "It is valid," she agreed softly, but not optimal. The words landed without force, and yet their impact was unmistakable. A few students leaned back in their chairs, absorbing the simplicity of that truth. Not disrespectful, not confrontational, just precise. Whitmore's expression tightened for a fraction of a second, then smoothed over again, the practiced composure returning, but thinner, now more fragile. He glanced once more at the board, then at Emily, as if reassessing something he had already judged too quickly. The realization was no longer avoidable. This was not an interruption, this was not a mistake, this was expertise, and it had revealed something he had overlooked, not just in the equation, but in the moment itself. The room remained still, the air thick with unspoken acknowledgement, and in that stillness something quietly shifted, not announced, not declared, but understood, because authority had not been taken, it had simply been questioned and found incomplete. And for the first time that morning, Professor Whitmore was no longer the only one in the room who held the answer. The air in the lecture hall no longer belonged to Professor Whitmore. It hovered somewhere between uncertainty and quiet anticipation, as if the room itself was waiting to see what would happen next. He turned slightly away from the board, adjusting his posture, regaining what composure he could. But the shift was undeniable. Something had cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for everyone to feel it. His voice returned, measured but careful. "Let us proceed," he said, gesturing lightly, as though the moment could simply be folded back into routine, as though it had not just redefined the space. Emily Carter gave a small nod, stepping away from the board, her movements unhurried, her expression unchanged. She did not look at the students, she did not look at Whitmore, she simply returned the chalk, placing it gently on the ledge, as if closing something that had already been decided. The faint sound echoed louder than it should have in the quiet room, as she began walking back toward her place, each step steady, each movement unremarkable, except for the fact that now I followed her, not with curiosity, not with amusement, but with something else, something closer to respect. A student near the aisle shifted in his seat, watching her pass, as if trying to reconcile the image of the quiet woman from before with the presence that had just commanded the entire room. Whitmore turned back to the board, picking up the chalk again, but this time his hand paused before writing, his eyes tracing the solution. Emily had left behind the clean structure, the undeniable clarity, and for the first time there was hesitation, not from lack of knowledge, but from awareness. He continued the lecture, but the rhythm was different now, the confidence still there, but tempered, his explanations slightly slower, as if measured against a new standard. A few students attempted to resume taking notes, but their focus drifted, their thoughts lingering on what they had just witnessed. One student raised his hand cautiously. Professor Whitmore hesitated for a fraction of a second before acknowledging him. Yes, the student began, glancing briefly at Emily before looking back at the board. Would her method always be more efficient? Whitmore's grip on the chalk tightened slightly, not enough to break, but enough to reveal tension. He considered the question longer than expected. "It depends on the context," he replied, choosing his words carefully. Though the answer did not carry the same finality it once would have. Another pause followed, and in that pause something subtle but irreversible settled across the room. The hierarchy had shifted, not in title, not in position, but in perception. Emily reached her seat near the back, sitting down quietly, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her gaze calm, forward, focused, as though she had already moved beyond the moment, while the rest of the room was still catching up. Whitmore continued speaking, but the attention he commanded now came with a different weight, no longer unquestioned, no longer absolute, and somewhere in the silence between his words the realization lingered, not spoken, not acknowledged, but present. That respect, once assumed, had to be earned again, and this time it would not come as easily. The lecture continued, but it no longer moved with the same certainty. Each word from Professor Whitmore carried a slight hesitation, as if weighed before being released, his usual rhythm disrupted by something he could not fully regain. The equations on the board grew more complex, yet the room no longer responded in the same way. Students were listening, but not with blind acceptance. They were watching, analyzing, measuring every step against what they had just seen. Emily Carter sat quietly near the back, her posture relaxed, her gaze forward. She took no notes, made no effort to draw attention, and yet her presence lingered in the room, like a quiet shift in gravity. A few students glanced back at her from time to time, quickly looking away when their eyes met hers, unsure of what to say or how to approach what had just happened. One student leaned toward another, whispering softly, "Do You know who she is? The other shook his head without taking his eyes off the board. No, but she should not be sitting back there. The words faded into silence as Whitmore turned slightly, his attention catching the movement. Though he said nothing, he continued writing another problem on the board, more complex than the last, as if complexity itself could restore the balance, as if difficulty could re-establish authority. The chalk moved faster now, the lines tighter, the structure denser. He stepped back and faced the class, his expression composed, but sharper than before. Let us see if anyone else would like to attempt this one, he said, his tone controlled, but carrying an edge that had not been there earlier. No hands were raised. The room remained still. Students avoided eye contact, the earlier confidence replaced by caution. Whitmore's gaze moved across the rows, then, without fully intending it, settled again on Emily. She did not react. She did not look up immediately, but after a moment her eyes lifted, meeting his calmly, not challenging, not hesitant, simply present. The silence stretched longer, this time heavier. Because now it was different. This was no longer about forcing someone forward. It was about acknowledging something that had already been revealed. Whitmore held her gaze for a brief second, then looked away, first a subtle shift, but one that did not go unnoticed by those watching closely. He turned back to the board, setting the chalk down more firmly than before, and began explaining the solution himself, his voice steady but quieter, the authority still there, but no longer absolute. As he spoke, a realization began to settle more clearly across the room. This was not a single moment. This was a turning point, not loud, not dramatic, but lasting. Something had changed in how they saw him, and in how they saw her. Emily lowered her gaze again, her expression unchanged, as if the moment had never belonged to her in the first place, as if she had simply done what was necessary and moved on. But the room had not moved on, not yet, and in the quiet space between each word spoken at the front of the room, the truth lingered stronger than before, that knowledge does not announce itself, and those who truly understand it rarely need to prove it twice. The lecture should have returned to normal, but it never truly did. Each equation Professor Whitmore wrote now carried a quiet weight, as if it had to prove itself in a way it never had before. The students followed along, but their attention was divided not by distraction, but by awareness. They were no longer just learning, they were evaluating, comparing, measuring. Something invisible had shifted, and no one could ignore it. Whitmore finished another explanation, stepping back from the board, his eyes scanning the room, searching, perhaps for reassurance or control, but what he found instead was hesitation. Students avoided his gaze, not out of fear, but uncertainty, as if the certainty he once represented had softened into something more human, more fallible. A long pause stretched across the lecture hall, and then from the middle row a voice spoke up. Professor, the student began cautiously, his tone respectful, but firm. Was her method something we should be focusing on more in this course? The question did not challenge, it did not accuse, but it carried a quiet implication that settled heavily in the room. Whitmore's expression tightened for a fraction of a second before smoothing over again. He turned slowly back to the board, as if the answer might be written there among the lines of chalk. The method presented in this course has been refined over many years, he said, carefully choosing each word. It is reliable and widely accepted. But even as he spoke, the sentence did not land with the same authority it once would have, because now there was something else in the room, something unspoken, yet undeniable. Emily Carter remained seated near the back, her posture unchanged, her presence still quiet, but no longer unnoticed. Another student turned halfway in his seat, glancing toward her, then back to Whitmore, as if weighing two sources of truth against each other. The room did not erupt, it did not challenge openly, but the shift was there in the silence, in the way students began to think rather than simply accept. Whitmore placed the chalk down once more, this time with less force, as if acknowledging something he could no longer control. His gaze moved again toward Emily, not sharply, not dismissively, but thoughtfully, as if seeing her for the first time, without assumption. Miss Carter, he said, his voice steadier, now though quieter than before, would you mind elaborating further on your approach for the class? The words hung in the air, different from before, no longer a trap, no longer a test, but something closer to recognition, a quiet invitation. The entire room turned toward her again, but this time the energy was not anticipation of failure. It was something else, something closer to respect. Emily looked up, meeting his gaze for a brief moment, then slowly stood, her movements calm, unhurried. She did not rush, she did not hesitate. She simply walked forward once more, the same path she had taken earlier, but now it felt entirely different. The distance shorter, the weight lighter, and as she reached the front of the room the silence returned, not heavy, not tense, but expectant, because now everyone understood this was no longer about proving anything, this was about revealing something that had always been there waiting to be seen. Emily Carter stepped to the front once more, the quiet rhythm of her footsteps no longer uncertain, but steady as the entire lecture hall followed her movement. Without a single distraction, the board still carried the earlier solution, clean, precise, undeniable, and now it waited not as a challenge, but as a continuation. She reached for the chalk again, her fingers relaxed, her posture composed, and without looking back she began to speak, her voice calm, clear, carrying easily across the room. The key difference is not complexity, she said gently, it is clarity. A few students leaned forward, instinctively drawn in not by volume, but by certainty. She lifted the chalk and began rewriting a portion of the equation, not erasing what had been done, but refining it, simplifying each transition step by step, her movements smooth, deliberate, every line purposeful. Professor Whitmore stood just to the side, no longer at the center of the room, his gaze fixed on the board, but his presence quieter now, not diminished, but changed. He was watching, listening. As Emily continued, the original method works, she said, but it introduces unnecessary steps. If you focus directly on the limit behavior, you can reach the same conclusion more efficiently. She paused briefly, allowing the structure to settle before adding the final connection, the last line forming with quiet precision as the entire solution revealed itself in its simplest form. The room did not react immediately, no applause, no sudden noise, just stillness, the kind that comes when understanding arrives all at once. A student near the front slowly lowered his pen, another leaned back, exhaling softly, as if releasing something unspoken, and then almost imperceptibly heads began to nod, not in excitement, but in recognition, because what they were seeing was not just correct, it was elegant. Whitmore stepped forward after a moment, his eyes moving across the board one final time before turning toward the class, his expression composed but different. There was no resistance left in it, no need to defend or redirect, only acknowledgement. That is a more efficient approach, he said, his voice steady, and for the first time completely aligned with what stood before him. The words carried through the room, not as authority, but as acceptance, and that difference mattered. Emily placed the chalk down gently, her part complete. She did not linger, she did not wait for recognition, she simply stepped back, her eyes calm, her presence returning to quiet, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but the room had changed. Every student felt it, not as a dramatic shift, but as something deeper, something that would remain long after the lecture ended. Whitmore glanced at her once more, then back at the class, as if understanding something beyond the equation itself, and in that moment the hierarchy that had once defined the room no longer stood the same, not because it had been challenged loudly, but because it had been revealed quietly, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was full of something far more lasting, because that day, in a room built on knowledge, everyone learned something no equation could fully capture, that respect is not given by title or appearance, but earned in the quiet certainty of truth, and the room remained still, holding that lesson long after the chalk had stopped moving.